The envelope was sitting on my pillow when I got home. No note, no explanation, just a white envelope with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting, neat, careful, like she'd practiced it. I should have known right then. My mother never wrote anything carefully unless it mattered. Unless she wanted it to last. I picked it up. My hands weren't shaking yet, that came later. Inside were 3 pages, stapled, notarized. Every line was clean and legal and final. At the top, in bold letters, it said, "Voluntary termination of parental relationship." I read it twice, then a third time. Then I sat down on the edge of my bed because my legs just stopped working. Tomorrow was my graduation day. I'd been at Westbrook University for 4 years. 4 years of 5 a.m. alarm clocks and instant noodles and crying in library bathrooms because I was so tired I couldn't see straight anymore. 4 years of working 2 part-time jobs, one at a campus coffee shop, one doing data entry for a local insurance firm, just to cover what my scholarship didn't. My parents hadn't paid for a single semester. Not one textbook, not one meal plan, nothing, and I hadn't asked them to. I'd learned very early that asking my parents for things was just a faster way to get told no. I grew up in a house where love had conditions, where approval was currency, and I was always broke. My older sister Dana had been the investment. Dana was beautiful and social and effortless in the way that made adults smile when she walked into a room. She got the new car at 16. She got the college fund. She got the hugs that lasted longer than 3 seconds. I got the comments. "Kelsey, why can't you be more like your sister? Kelsey, you're too serious. Nobody likes a girl who's always got her nose in a book. Kelsey, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Not everyone is meant for big things." That last one came from my father. I was 14. I just won a regional science competition, first place, out of 62 students. I'd come home with a trophy taller than my backpack and a certificate signed by the district superintendent. My dad looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Then he said, "Don't let it go to your head," and went back to watching television. I put the trophy in my closet. I never took it out again. By the time I got to high school, I'd already figured out the system. I wasn't going to get their support, so I was going to build something they couldn't ignore. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I stayed after school for academic programs. I emailed professors at universities asking about research opportunities for high schoolers, and 2 of them actually said yes. My parents thought it was weird. My mother once told her sister within earshot of me that she worried I was obsessed, and that it wasn't healthy for a girl my age to care so much about school. I kept going anyway. When I got into Westbrook on a partial academic scholarship, I thought maybe this is the moment, maybe they'll see it now. My mother's response was, "It's not Harvard." My father didn't say anything at all. I moved into my dorm 3 weeks later with 2 suitcases and a mini fridge I'd bought with babysitting money. I didn't cry when they dropped me off. I'd already done that crying alone months before, when I'd finally accepted that nothing I did was ever going to be enough for them. College was hard, I won't pretend otherwise. There were nights I worked a closing shift at the coffee shop, came back to my dorm at midnight, and still had a paper due at 8 a.m. There were semesters where I was running on 4 hours of sleep and sheer stubbornness. There were moments, real, dark moments, where I sat in my car in the campus parking lot and asked myself if any of this was worth it. But then I'd think about that trophy in the closet, and something in me would go quiet and cold and certain. I kept going. Junior year, I started working on an independent research project. It wasn't required. It wasn't for a grade. I'd noticed something in the data entry work I was doing for the insurance firm, a pattern in claim denials that didn't make statistical sense. I started pulling public records, cross-referencing, building a model. My academic advisor, Professor Hartley, saw what I was doing and told me to write it up formally. She said it was the kind of work that had real-world implications. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I wrote it up, submitted it to 3 academic journals. One of them published it. I was 20 years old. I didn't tell my parents. There was no point. By senior year, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond sleep. I was tired of proving myself, tired of being overlooked, tired of going home for holidays and sitting at a dinner table where my sister's new apartment was the main topic of conversation, and my published research paper was never once mentioned, because they didn't know about it, and even if they had, I'm not sure it would have mattered. The last time I visited home was Thanksgiving of my senior year. My mother spent the entire dinner talking about Dana's new boyfriend, how successful he was, how good-looking, how Dana had really landed on her feet. At one point, my father looked at me across the table and said, "So what's your plan after graduation, Kelsey? You got anything lined up?" I said I had some possibilities I was exploring. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're being polite but not convinced. Then he turned back to my mother and said, "Dana's boyfriend is taking her to Napa next month." I drove back to campus that night and I didn't go home again. So when I found those papers on my pillow 3 months later, the night before my graduation, I wasn't completely surprised. Hurt, yes. Blindsided, yes. But surprised, not really. I read every line. The language was formal and cold and thorough. They had clearly consulted someone, maybe a lawyer, maybe just the internet, because it was structured like they meant it, like they'd thought about it. Like it wasn't a reaction, it was a decision. There was a line near the bottom that said, "We wish Kelsey no ill will, but we believe this separation is in the best interest of all parties." Best interest of all parties. I set the papers down on my desk. I looked at them for a long time, then I got out my iron and pressed my graduation gown, because tomorrow I was walking across that stage whether they were in those seats or not. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, those familiar creaks and sighs that used to feel like home and now just felt like noise. The papers were still on my desk. I'd thought about moving them, putting them in a drawer or folding them back into the envelope, or, I don't know, throwing them out the window. I left them where they were. There's something about seeing a thing clearly that matters. Even when the thing is ugly, even when it hurts. I needed to see those papers. I needed them to be real and present and undeniable, because some part of me, the part that was still 14 years old and holding a trophy, kept wanting to make excuses for them. Maybe they were having a bad week, maybe this was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe if I just tried harder, said the right thing, was somehow different. No, I shut that part down. I'd been shutting it down for years and I was tired of how long it took. So I let the papers sit there on the desk and I stared at the ceiling and I made myself accept the truth that I'd been circling for most of my life. They were never going to choose me, not because I wasn't enough, but because they'd decided somewhere along the way that I wasn't the story they wanted to tell. Dana was their story. Dana was easy and familiar and reflected back something they recognized in themselves. I was inconvenient, too focused, too independent, too much of something they didn't know how to categorize, and people fear what they can't categorize. I understood that now. It didn't make it hurt less, but understanding it meant I could put it down, really put it down, instead of carrying it into every room I walked into for the rest of my life. I got up at 6, showered, did my hair, put on the small gold earrings my roommate Maya had given me as a graduation gift. She'd gone home 2 days ago, but she'd left them on my pillow with a note that said, "You earned every single second of this. Don't let anyone take that from you." I read that note 3 times. Then I put on my graduation gown, picked up my cap, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I looked tired. I looked like someone who had been running a very long race on not enough sleep. But I also looked like someone who had finished. And there's a kind of dignity in that, in the finishing, that no piece of paper on a desk could take away. I drove to campus alone. The ceremony was held in Westbrook's main auditorium, a big, high-ceilinged space that smelled like fresh flowers and nervous energy. Families were already filling the seats when I arrived, clusters of people with cameras and matching t-shirts and handmade signs. A woman near the entrance was crying already, and her daughter was laughing and telling her to stop, and they were holding onto each other the way people do when they're both pretending to be fine. I watched them for a second longer than I should have. Then I found my place in the graduate lineup and I focused on standing straight. The auditorium filled up fast. I could see the family seating section from where I stood, rows and rows of people, buzzing with anticipation. I scanned the rows without meaning to. Old habit, looking for familiar faces. I found them in the fourth row, my parents. My mother in a blue dress I didn't recognize, her hair done carefully. My father in a dark blazer, sitting stiff and formal the way he always did in public places. And next to them, Dana, of course. Dana in a yellow sundress already on her phone. They'd come. After everything, after those 3 notarized pages, after best interest of all parties, they had come to my graduation. I stood very still and I thought about what that meant. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe Dana had talked them into it. Maybe they wanted to see with their own eyes that I was still just Kelsey, still the daughter who hadn't lived up to whatever version of success they'd imagined for her. I looked away. It didn't matter why they were there. What mattered was that I was here, that I'd got myself here, every single dollar, every single late night, every single moment of doubt that I'd pushed through without anyone holding my hand. That was mine. That would always be mine. The ceremony started with the usual formalities, a welcome address from the university president, a few announcements, a student speaker who talked about resilience in a way that was genuinely moving even if I'd heard versions of it before. I clapped at the right moments, I breathed slowly, I kept my shoulders back. Then the dean introduced a special guest. That's the word he used, special. He said there was someone in the audience who had reached out to the university several weeks ago, someone who had come across a piece of academic work that had, in his words, stopped him mid-meeting and made him read it 3 times. The auditorium got a little quieter. The dean said this guest had asked for permission to say a few words before the diploma presentation. The university had been honored to oblige. A man stood up from the front row. I hadn't noticed him before, or rather, I'd noticed him the way you notice people who seem slightly out of place without knowing why. He was tall, maybe late 50s, in a charcoal suit that had the particular kind of quiet quality that very expensive things have. No tie, silver at his temples. The kind of stillness about him that people develop when they've spent decades in rooms where everyone is watching them. He walked to the podium. The dean leaned into the microphone one more time and said, "Please welcome Mr. Gerald Foss, CEO of Meridian Analytics." Meridian Analytics. My brain did something strange when I heard that name. A kind of electric recognition, like touching a doorknob in winter. Because Meridian Analytics was not a small company. Meridian Analytics was a Fortune 500 firm, one of the largest data intelligence companies in the country, the kind of name that appeared in business school case studies and Wall Street Journal headlines. And I had no idea why their CEO was standing at a podium at my graduation ceremony. Gerald Foss adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the graduates with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who was exactly where he intended to be. He said, "I'll keep this brief because I know you're all here for the diplomas, not for me." A small laugh moved through the crowd. Then he said, "But I want to tell you about a research paper I read 8 months ago. A paper written by one of your classmates. A paper that identified a systemic flaw in insurance claim processing that my own team of analysts, people with decades of experience, had missed entirely." The auditorium was very quiet now. "That paper," he said, "saved my company from a significant liability exposure, and it led us to restructure an entire division." He paused. "I'd like to thank the person who wrote it." And then he looked up directly into the graduate section and he said my name. He said my name like it was a complete sentence. Not rushed, not uncertain, just Kelsey Hartman, clear and deliberate into a microphone in a room of 800 people. And for exactly 3 seconds I didn't move. I don't know what I expected my reaction to be. I'd imagined a lot of scenarios for this day, walking across the stage, shaking the dean's hand, holding my diploma and thinking about every night I'd spent wanting to quit. I'd imagined those things in detail, rehearsed them quietly in my head the way you do when something matters too much to leave to chance. I had not imagined this. Someone behind me whispered, "That's you, go." I stepped forward. The graduate section was arranged alphabetically, so I was near the back. Walking to the front meant passing rows of my classmates, people I'd studied with, pulled all-nighters with, stood in coffee lines with at 7 in the morning when we were all too tired to form complete sentences. Some of them were already turning to look at me, some of them were clapping. One girl, Priya, from my senior seminar grabbed my arm as I passed and squeezed it once hard without saying anything. I kept walking. Gerald Foss stepped back from the podium as I approached. He didn't return to his seat. He waited. And when I reached the front of the stage, he extended his hand, not the quick professional handshake of someone going through a motion, but a real one, firm and deliberate, the kind that means something. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I've been wanting to do this for months. Your work is exceptional." I said, "Thank you." It came out steadier than I felt. The dean handed me my diploma. The auditorium erupted, not the polite, rhythmic applause that had accompanied the previous names, but something louder and less organized. The kind of sound a crowd makes when it's reacting to something it didn't see coming. Someone in the family section let out an actual cheer. Camera flashes went off in clusters. I stood at that podium for maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds doesn't sound like much. But when you've spent 4 years being invisible, when you've spent most of your life being the person in the room that no one quite sees, 15 seconds in a spotlight feels like a very long time. I looked out at the auditorium. I wasn't looking for them. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't standing there scanning the crowd for my parents' faces like some kind of dramatic movie moment. I was just looking, taking it in. Trying to stay present in a moment that felt like it was happening slightly faster than I could process it. But I found them anyway. 4th row, left side, my mother in the blue dress. She wasn't clapping. She was sitting completely still, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing something I'd never seen it do before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was something more complicated than either of those, a kind of frozen recalculation, like a person who has just been handed information that doesn't fit into any category they prepared for. My father was the same, upright, motionless. His program was still in his hands, held at a slight angle like he'd stopped mid-motion when the name was called and hadn't resumed. Dana had put her phone down. I looked at the three of them for exactly as long as it took me to understand what I was seeing. Then I turned away, not dramatically, not with any particular statement intended. I just turned away. Because there was nothing left in that direction that I needed. I walked back to my seat. The ceremony continued. More names, more applause, more camera flashes and handmade signs held up in the family section. I sat with my diploma in my hands and I breathed. At some point during the remaining presentations, Gerald Foss made his way back to his seat in the front row. But before he sat down, he leaned over to the university's director of academic affairs. I could see them from where I was, and handed her a business card and what looked like a folded letter. She looked at it, looked at him, nodded. I filed that away and kept breathing. After the ceremony, the auditorium dissolved into the beautiful chaos that always follows these things, people surging toward each other, flowers being thrust into graduates' arms, someone's grandmother crying into a handkerchief nearby. I stood in the middle of it holding my diploma and my cap, and for a moment I just let it wash over me. The noise, the movement, the realness of it. Then someone touched my elbow. I turned. It was the director of academic affairs, Dr. Renee Calloway, a precise, no-nonsense woman I'd interacted with exactly twice before today. She was holding the folded letter. She said, "Miss Hartman, Mr. Foss asked me to make sure this reached you personally." I took it. It was a formal offer letter, Meridian Analytics letterhead, clean, dense paragraphs of professional language that I read quickly, then slowly, then quickly again. Full-time position, research division. A salary number that made my vision blur slightly at the edges. A start date of the 1st of next month. And at the bottom, a handwritten line in Gerald Foss's own writing, "Your instincts are right. Trust them, we'll handle the rest." I folded the letter carefully. I looked up and across the thinning crowd, maybe 30 feet away, I saw my parents. They were standing together, not moving toward the exit, not moving toward me. Just standing, watching. My mother's expression had shifted into something that might have been, in a different version of this story, the beginning of an apology. My father had his hands in his pockets. Dana was behind them, her phone back out, but she wasn't looking at it. They were all looking at me. I held the diploma in one hand and the offer letter in the other, and I thought about those 3 pages on my desk. The notarized signature, best interest of all parties. I thought about the trophy in the closet. I thought about every dinner table comment, every dismissal, every moment I'd been made to feel like my ambitions were an inconvenience, my achievements a source of mild embarrassment, my entire self somehow slightly less than what this family needed me to be. I thought about Maya's note on my pillow, "You earned every single second of this." And then I did something I hadn't planned. I walked toward them. I want to be clear about something. I didn't walk toward them because I wanted a reconciliation scene. I didn't walk toward them because some part of me was still hoping, still doing that 14-year-old thing of looking for the moment they'd finally see me. I was done with that. I'd made my peace with that somewhere between midnight and 6 in the morning, lying in my childhood bed with those papers on my desk. I walked toward them because I had something to return. The crowd had thinned enough that the space between us was clear. 30 feet. 20. 10. I watched their faces change as I got closer, my mother straightening slightly, my father pulling his hands out of his pockets, Dana taking a small step back like she wasn't sure which direction this was going. I stopped about 3 feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to be clear. My mother opened her mouth first. She said, "Kelsey," I said, "I'm not here to argue." She closed her mouth. I reached into the inside pocket of my graduation gown. I'd put the envelope there this morning before I left the house, because I'd known this moment was coming even if I hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. I pulled it out, the white envelope with my name in my mother's careful handwriting. I held it out to my father. He looked at it, then at me. He didn't take it immediately. There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone is trying to figure out what move they're looking at. I said, "You asked me to sign it." "I did." He took the envelope. Inside were the 3 pages notarized, stapled, exactly as they'd been left on my pillow. And at the bottom of the last page, below the line that said best interest of all parties, was my signature. Clean, deliberate, in the same careful way my mother had written my name on the outside. My father opened the envelope, looked at the papers. His jaw tightened once, just once, and then went still. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I said, "You made your decision last night. I'm respecting it." I wasn't angry when I said it. That's the part that surprised even me. There was no heat in my voice, no tremor, none of the emotion I'd expected to feel standing this close to them in this moment. Just a kind of clear, settled certainty, like a door closing gently instead of slamming. My mother said, "We came today because we wanted." "I know why you came," I said. "And I'm glad you did. I want you to have seen it. I want you to know exactly what you decided to walk away from." That landed. I could see it land, in the way my mother's eyes moved away from mine, in the way my father's grip on the envelope tightened slightly. Dana was very still behind them. I looked at my sister for a moment. Dana and I had never been enemies, that was important to say, even just to myself. Dana hadn't chosen to be the favorite any more than I'd chosen to be overlooked. She'd just been handed a different role in a story neither of us had written. I didn't blame her for that. She met my eyes, and something passed between us, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement, a recognition. The kind that doesn't need words because words would only make it smaller. I gave her a small nod. She nodded back. Then I looked at my parents one last time. My father was still holding the envelope. My mother had composed herself back into stillness, but her eyes were bright in a way I recognized. She was close to crying and refusing to do it in public, which was possibly the most my mother thing she'd ever done. I said, "I hope you're well. I genuinely mean that." And then I turned around. I walked back through the thinning auditorium, through the side doors, and out into the afternoon. The sky was that particular shade of late spring blue that feels almost aggressive in its brightness. The kind of sky that doesn't care what just happened inside, that just keeps being blue and enormous and indifferent. I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed it in. Dr. Calloway found me there about 10 minutes later. She said Gerald Foss had asked if I had time for a brief conversation before he left. He was in the small reception room off the main lobby if I was available. I said I was available. Gerald Foss was standing by the window when I came in, coffee cup in hand, looking out at the campus with the expression of someone who is genuinely comfortable with silence. He turned when he heard me come in and smiled, not the performative smile of someone managing an impression, but a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. He said, "How are you doing?" That was a lot for one morning. I said, "I'm okay, better than okay, actually." He nodded like he believed me. Then he gestured to the chairs and we both sat down, and for the next 40 minutes we talked, really talked, about my research, about what I'd seen in the data, about where I thought the model could go with proper resources and a team behind it. He asked sharp questions. I gave him straight answers. There was none of the performance of a job interview. It felt more like two people who had already decided to work together and were just figuring out the shape of it. At one point he said, "I have to ask, why didn't you reach out after the paper was published? Most people in your position would have tried to leverage that." I thought about it for a second. Then I said, I wasn't doing it for leverage. I was doing it because the problem was interesting and I wanted to solve it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly why I'm here." I started at Meridian Analytics on the 1st of the following month. The work was hard and consuming, and exactly what I'd spent 4 years preparing for without knowing it. My team was sharp and demanding and treated my ideas with a seriousness I was still getting used to, still adjusting to the feeling of being in a room where what I said was written down instead of dismissed. I found an apartment. A real one, not a dorm room, not a childhood bedroom with papers on the desk, but a place that was mine. 3rd floor, big windows, a kitchen where I made coffee every morning and stood looking out at the street below and felt something I didn't have a precise word for. Settled maybe, arrived. My parents didn't reach out for several months. When my mother finally called on a Tuesday evening in October while I was making dinner, I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message later. She said she'd been thinking. She said she wanted to talk. She said, and this was the part that stayed with me that I played back twice, "I think we made a mistake." I sat with that for a long time. I didn't call back that night or that week. I needed to think about what I wanted, not what would make them feel better, not what would make me look gracious or forgiving or mature. What I actually wanted. What I decided was this. I was willing to have a relationship with my parents. A real one, not the old one, not the version where I made myself smaller to fit into a story they'd already written. A new one, built on different terms. Terms that included honesty and respect and the basic acknowledgement that I was a person worth investing in. That was my offer, take it or leave it. My mother called again 3 weeks later. We talked for an hour. It was uncomfortable and halting and nothing like the movies. There was no single moment of breakthrough, no dramatic tearful reconciliation, just two people carefully, cautiously trying to figure out if there was something worth salvaging. I don't know yet how that story ends. I'm still in the middle of it. But here's what I know. I know that I walked across a stage on the worst morning of my life and I held my head up. I know that I signed those papers not out of defeat but out of clarity, because some doors need to be closed before new ones can open. And I was done leaving doors half open that were only letting in cold air. I know that the trophy is still in my closet. I'm going to take it out sometime. Put it somewhere I can see it. Not for them, not to prove anything to anyone who doubted me, just for me. For the 14-year-old who carried it home alone and put it away in the dark and kept going anyway.